He had always prided himself on his devotion. He wasn't a remarkable man. He was plain, average in every way. But his capacity to love was extraordinary. When she chose him, it felt as though all the stars in the universe had aligned in his favor. She wasn't just beautiful, she was radiant. The kind of beauty that turned heads wherever she went. But it wasn't just her appearance that captivated people. It was her charm, her wit, the way she made everyone feel seen and important. She lit up rooms with her presence, and somehow she had chosen him. They met at a friend's dinner party. He had been standing awkwardly by the drinks table, clutching a glass of cheap red wine and trying to avoid eye contact with anyone. She walked in, her laughter ringing out like music, and the room seemed to shift around her. Everyone gravitated toward her, drawn in by her magnetic energy. He was content to admire her from a distance, but then, to his shock, she made her way toward him. "You're the only person here who doesn't look like they're trying to impress anyone," she said, flashing him a smile that made his heart race. I like that. From that moment he was hooked. Their connection felt like destiny. Their connection felt like destiny. She was everything he had ever dreamed of, and he became everything she wanted him to be. He devoted himself to her happiness, working tirelessly to build a life that she could be proud of. He took on extra shifts, sacrificed his hobbies, and did everything he could to make her smile. For a while, it seemed like it was enough. They laughed together, shared dreams, and built a life that felt like a fairy tale. But as the years went by, things began to change. It started subtly that he almost didn't notice. She began staying out later, her excuses vague and dismissive. "It's just work," she said one night when she came home well past midnight. "Don't make such a big deal out of it." He didn't press her. He didn't press her. Trusted her. Why wouldn't he? She was his wife, the woman who had promised to love him forever. Then there were the weekends away. Team-building retreats, she called them, though she never offered much detail. He would watch her leave with her suitcase, forcing a smile, as she kissed him goodbye. "Don't worry," she said. "I'll call when I can," but the calls were infrequent. And when she did call, her voice was distant, distracted. He wanted to believe her, so he did. He told himself that she was just as busy, that her job demanded a lot of her, that he was being paranoid, but the signs became harder to ignore. The faint scent of unfamiliar cologne on her clothes, the way she tilted her phone away when he walked into the room, the laughter in her voice when she answered late-night calls, her back turned to him as she whispered into the receiver. One night, as she showered, she left her phone on the kitchen counter. A message lit up the screen. "Last night was incredible. Can't wait to see you again." The sender was saved as work, but the tone was unmistakable. His stomach churned as he stared at the message, his hands trembling. When she came downstairs, he confronted her, his voice shaking. "What is this?" he asked, holding up the phone. She glanced at the screen, then burst out laughing. "You're jealous of a coworker," she said, shaking her head. "That's pathetic." From that moment on, everything changed. She stopped pretending, stopped trying to hide her infidelity. She would dress in tight, revealing outfits, her makeup applied with precision, and leave the house without explanation. "Don't wait up," she said one night, smirking as she grabbed her purse. He sat in the living room for hours, staring at the clock, his mind racing with questions he didn't want to answer. When she returned, it was always the same. Her hair slightly mussed, her lipstick smudged, the faint scent of another man lingering on her skin. She would brush past him without a word, her only acknowledgement a disdainful glance. "You don't ask where I've been anymore," she said one morning, sipping her coffee with a smirk. Are you finally learning your place? He wanted to leave. He even packed a bag once, his hands shaking as he zipped it closed. But when she saw him standing by the door, her expression changed. Her eyes filled with tears, her lip trembling. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're the only one who really loves me. Please stay, stay." Her tears broke him. He dropped the bag and nodded, hating himself as he let her pull him back inside. That night, as she lay beside him, her breathing steady in sleep, he stared at the ceiling and wondered how much more he could endure. Her tears, appetite for other men seemed endless. Businessmen, bartenders, strangers she met at clubs. No one was off limits. She began bringing them home, parading them in front of him as if daring him to object. "Be a good boy and stay in your room. Be a good boy and stay in your room," she said one night, her voice dripping with mockery as she led another man into their bedroom. He sat in the guest room, his chest tight with humiliation and rage. From behind the closed door, he could hear their laughter, the sounds of their laughter, the sounds of their bodies moving together, her moans echoing through the house. He buried his face in his hands, tears streaming down his cheeks. This was his life now, a spectator to his wife's relentless infidelity, a prisoner in his own home. Some nights she came home with two men. They laughed and joked with her in the living room while he sat silently in the corner, unable to look them in the eye. She would glance at him and smirk. "Don't worry," she said. "We won't need the guest room." Each night was a new humiliation, each day a fresh reminder of how little he meant to her. He stopped going out, stopped seeing friends, stopped trying to maintain any semblance of a normal life. He became a shadow of the man he once was, consumed by despair and self-loathing. Her behavior grew more audacious with each passing week. It wasn't just the frequency of her infidelity, it was the way she reveled in it. Her cruelty sharpened to a razor's edge. She seemed to take pleasure in humiliating him and reminding him of how powerless he had become. One evening she came home with a man nearly half her age. He looked like a college student, lean and full of arrogant confidence. Walked through the door, laughing loudly, her voice echoing through the silent house. "This is my husband," she said casually, gesturing toward him like he was a piece of furniture. "Don't worry about him. He's harmless." Smirked, barely sparing him a glance. "You're lucky," he said to her, his arm tightening around her waist. "I wouldn't put up with that." She laughed, a cruel, ringing sound that made his stomach twist. "Oh, he's fine," she said. "He knows his place." They disappeared into the bedroom, leaving him sitting on the couch, staring at the wall. He could hear them through the thin walls, the laughter, the murmured words, the sounds that tore at his soul. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. But he didn't move. He didn't say a word. He simply sat there, paralyzed by his own despair. The nights blurred together, each one worse than the last. She brought home strangers, men who treated him with open disdain, their eyes mocking as they followed her into the bedroom. She no longer bothered to be discreet. Some nights, she didn't even close the door. She wanted him to hear, to know exactly what she was doing. "Why are you still here?" she asked him one morning, her tone dripping with contempt. "You're like a dog that doesn't know when it's not wanted." He didn't answer. He didn't know why he stayed. Maybe it was because he still loved her, or maybe it was because he still loved her. Or maybe it was because he didn't know how to leave. She had stripped him of everything. His pride, his dignity, his sense of self. He felt like a hollow shell. a ghost haunting the ruins of their marriage. The breaking point came on what should have been their anniversary. He had clung to the hope that there was still something left between them, that he could remind her of what they once had. He spent the entire day preparing, cleaning the house, cooking her favorite meal, lighting candles, and setting the table with care. He even bought her flowers, a bouquet of white lilies like the ones she had carried on their wedding day. She came home late, as always, her laughter echoing down the hallway. She wasn't alone. A tall, broad-shouldered man followed her inside, his arm draped over her shoulder. She froze when she saw the table, the candles flickering in the dim light, the flowers arranged in the center. For a moment, she looked almost surprised. Then she laughed. A sharp, cruel sound that cut through the silence. "Oh, this is precious," she said, her lips curling into a smirk. "You actually thought we were going to celebrate?" Her lover chuckled, shaking his head. "Poor guy," he said. "Doesn't know when to quit." She walked over to the table, plucking one of the lilies from the vase and twirling it between her fingers. "You know," she said, her voice light and mocking, "I used to think this was sweet. Now it's just pathetic." She dropped the flower onto the table, her expression hardening. "Clean this up," she said, her tone cold and dismissive. Then she turned and walked into the bedroom. Lover following close behind. That night, he sat at the table long after the candles had burned out, staring at the untouched plates, the wine he had poured, the flowers she had discarded. Something inside him broke. He felt it. A deep, wrenching crack that left him hollow and empty. He had nothing left to give. She had taken everything. The next morning, he packed a bag. He didn't tell her he was leaving. He didn't leave a note. He simply walked out the door and kept walking, the weight of years of pain and humiliation pressing down on him like a stone. He drove for hours, the city blurring past him as tears streamed down his face. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get away, to escape the house that had become his prison. By the time he reached the edge of the river, the sun was beginning to rise, casting the water in shades of gold and pink. He sat there for a long time, staring at the horizon, his mind a whirlwind of memories and regrets. Finally, he took out his phone and typed a message. "I'm sorry I wasn't enough. I hope you find happiness." When she received the message, she barely glanced at it before tossing her phone aside. It wasn't until the police called later that evening that she realized the gravity of what had happened. They found his car abandoned by the river, his phone still on the dashboard. He was gone. For a moment, she felt a pang of guilt. She poured herself a glass of wine, raising it in a mock toast. "To freedom," she said aloud, her voice hollow. But as the days turned into weeks, the emptiness began to creep in. She had won. She had broken him completely, destroyed the one person who had loved her without question. And yet, in her victory, she found no joy, only the haunting echo of a love she had thrown away. She was left alone, a prisoner of her own desires, haunted by the memory of the man she had destroyed. Silence of the house became unbearable. For the first time in years, she was truly alone. The lovers she had once paraded through the house seemed to lose their luster. Their attention, which she had once craved, now felt hollow. They laughed too loudly, spoke too casually, and none of them seemed to notice the growing void inside her. At first, she tried to distract herself. She threw parties inviting anyone she could think of. Colleagues, old friends, even strangers she had met in passing. The house was filled with music and laughter, but no matter how many people surrounded her, the emptiness remained. The celebrations felt forced, the smiles brittle, the conversations shallow. "You've got everything." One of her friends said one night, raising a glass in her honor. "A beautiful house, freedom, and men lining up for you. You're living the dream." She smiled at the compliment, but the words rang hollow. At the back of her mind, she thought of him. Quiet presence, his unwavering devotion, the way he had loved her despite everything. She tried to shake the thought away, telling herself she didn't miss him. He had been weak, pathetic, unworthy of her. She had told herself that for years, and yet the memory of him lingered. One night, as the last of her guests filed out, leaving behind empty glasses and the scent of stale perfume, she found herself wandering through the house. She stopped in the dining room, staring at the table where he had once tried to celebrate their anniversary. The memory hit her with startling clarity. The flickering candles, the carefully arranged flowers, the way he had looked at her with hope in his eyes. She had laughed at him, mocked his efforts, discarded his love like it was nothing. For the first time, she felt a flicker of regret. She sat at the table, tracing her fingers over the wood, her chest tightening. She tried to remind herself of all the reasons she had despised him, but the justifications felt thin. The truth was, he had loved her more deeply than anyone else ever had, and she had destroyed him. As the weeks turned into months, the cracks in her carefully constructed world began to show. The lovers she brought home grew fewer and fewer. They seemed to sense her unease, the emptiness that no amount of passion or attention could fill. They stopped calling, stopped visiting, leaving her with nothing but the echoes of her past. She began to withdraw, spending her days in the quiet of the house. The parties stopped, the music faded, and the laughter she had once surrounded herself with was replaced by silence. She found herself thinking of him more often, remembering the little things she had once taken for granted. The way he always made her coffee in the morning, the way he listened to her without judgment, the way he had loved her even when she didn't deserve it. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, she went to the closet where he had kept his things. Most of it was gone. He had taken so little with him when he left, but a few remnants remained. A sweater, worn and soft, still faintly carrying his scent. A pair of shoes he had worn to work every day. She sat on the floor, clutching the sweater, her tears falling silently as she realized how much she had lost. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the weight of her actions. She thought of all the times he had stayed, even when she had pushed him to the brink, all the times he had forgiven her, had tried to remind her of the love they had once shared, and she had repaid him with cruelty, with disdain, with betrayal. She picked up her phone, scrolling through old messages and photos. There were pictures of them from happier times, smiling at the camera, holding hands, laughing together. She stopped at a photo from their honeymoon, the two of them standing on a beach, the sun setting behind them. She looked at his face, at the way he was looking at her, and for the first time, she saw the depth of his love. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had been wrong about everything. She had thought his love was weakness, but it had been strength. She had thought his devotion was pathetic, but it had been pure. And now, he was gone. She had pushed him so far that he had broken, and there was no undoing the damage she had done. She spent the rest of the night sitting in the darkness, clutching his sweater, her mind replaying every moment she had hurt him. Every word, every action, every cruel remark. She thought of the message he had sent her before he was gone, the last thing he had ever said to her. "I'm sorry. I wasn't enough. I hope you find happiness." The words haunted her. She had spent years chasing happiness, thinking she could find it in the arms of strangers, in the thrill of conquest, in the fleeting rush of being desired. Realized that happiness had been there all along, in the man she had thrown away. She tried to move on, to bury the regret and guilt, but it clung to her like a shadow. She thought about reaching out to his family, to his friends, but she couldn't bring herself to face them. What would she even say? There were no words that could undo what she had done. Over time, the house began to feel like a mausoleum, a monument to the life she had destroyed. She stopped opening the curtains, letting the darkness envelop her. She stopped answering calls, stopped seeing friends, stopped trying to fill the void. She spent her days wandering through the empty rooms, haunted by memories of him. Years passed, and she grew older. Her once radiant beauty fading. Craved was gone, replaced by pitying glances and whispers behind her back. The men who had once chased her were nowhere to be found, their promises of passion and devotion as fleeting as her happiness. One day, as she stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection, she hardly recognized herself. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, tired, empty, broken. She thought of him again, as she always did, and wondered what he would have said if he could see her now. Would he pity her? Would he forgive her? Or would he feel nothing at all? The thought was too much to bear. She turned away from the mirror, clutching her chest as the weight of her regret threatened to crush her. She had spent her life chasing freedom, chasing pleasure, chasing everything she thought she wanted. And in the end, all she had was the memory of the man who had loved her, and the knowledge that she had destroyed him. She was alone, as she always would be.